Boston, then boarded the unmanned merchant ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, at anchor in the harbor. In 3 hours' time, the poorly disguised savages broke open 342 chests of dutiable tea and dumped it overboard. Boston's Sons of Liberty, sons of violence to royal officials, and their supporters painted their faces and crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They violated a fundamental precept of English common law by deliberately destroying private property. The Boston Tea Party, at least in its generalities, is one of the best-known events in American history. It was emblematic of the developing American character. Inventive, unpredictable, brash, raucous, and violent. It was so unique and iconic that protesters throughout the American cities, including Charleston, attempted to emulate it with varying degrees of success. A parliamentary duty on a common grocery item. The destruction of 3 shiploads of tea in one of the colony's largest ports. What were the circumstances that brought colonial America's favorite non-alcoholic beverage center stage in yet another confrontation between the mother country and her obstreperous children? By 1773, the East India Company was the world's largest corporation. In Britain, it held a monopoly on all Asian trade. Among its stockholders are some of the country's richest and most influential families. However, there was a big problem. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And the even bigger problem? The enterprise was so intertwined with the British economy that its collapse would have been calamitous. What was the solution? A bailout! A government bailout. Then, as now, a government bailout. Under no circumstances could this mammoth company be allowed to fail. So, got it. So in May of 1773, Parliament convened and enacted 3 pieces of legislation. Number 1, a £1.5 million loan. Number 2, the Regulating Act. For the first time, the government was going to provide some oversight. And finally, as somebody already mentioned, the Tea Act itself. The company would receive tariff rebates on American-bound tea shipments, and the Customs Service would collect the 3 penny per pound tax, threepence, upon arrival in the colonies. But to be clear, this wasn't a new tax. It was the last vestige of the Townshend Acts after all the other taxes had been repealed. Other benefits: the right to set prices and the right to choose American merchants to market the tea. The Tea Act went into effect on November 1st, 1773. The company made contracts with shippers involved in trade between London and the largest American cities. In late September, 7 tea ships disembarked from England. 4 small ones were headed to Boston. 3 larger ones were destined for New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. The London was on its way to Charleston. The Atlantic Ocean in the autumn of 1773 offered rough passage for these ships. Finally, the London, captained by Alexander Curling, arrived in Charleston on December 1st with 257 chests on board. The arrival triggered a call for a public meeting at the Exchange. Out of this December 3rd meeting, an Oversight and Enforcement Committee, later called the General Committee, was formed, including future patriots Christopher Gadsden and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. A non-importation agreement was drafted to be circulated among the city merchants for their signatures. When called before the committee, the consignees, the gentleman who had ordered the tea shipment, Roger Smith and partners Peter Legere and William Greenwood declined to accept the orders and signed the agreement. All other goods were removed from the ship, leaving only the nauseous draft on board. A stalemate ensued. The British customs officials did nothing. The committee did nothing. 3 days after this meeting, a letter appeared in the South Carolina Gazette. Common at the time, the correspondent chose to write under a pompous pseudonym, Junius Brutus. The letter was initially supportive. Went to town and attended your general meeting on the 3rd, and returned home quite happy, as your proceedings fully confirm my good opinion of you. The record will reflect lasting honor that you did not consent to receiving 257 chests of tea. But then, the letter took an odd turn. Indeed, if a total disuse of India teas could take place, a very great physical as well as political evil would be removed. See, my dear ladies, for now I address myself to you, what the learned Dr. Tissot says of it. Amongst the favored beverages, the worst is the infusion of that famous leaf known as tea, which to our great detriment for the last 2 centuries has been constantly imported from China and Japan. This pernicious gift first destroys the strength of the stomach, and if not soon set aside, equally destroys the viscera, the blood, the nerves, and the whole body, so that malignant and chronic disorders will increase, especially nervous disorders. Ooh. This because at the time I thought this was preposterous. How could avid tea drinkers be convinced that it was detrimental to their health? My friends, I was naive. Okay, back to the standoff. As you recall, neither the British customs officials nor the General Committee had taken any action. However, this lull had a limit. According to customs regulations, the royal government had seizure rights if the tariffs were not paid within 20 days. The deadline was December 21st. In the early morning hours of December 22nd, 1773, customs officers and their hired hands, with the protection of the sheriff and his deputies, boarded the London, offloaded the 257 chests, and stored them in the exchange cellars. In the next issue of the South Carolina Gazette, editor-publisher Peter Timothy was awestruck. It was done with so much expedition that the whole job was completed before most imagined it would have begun. There was never an instance of so great a number of packages being taken out and stored in so short a time. Why was Timothy so impressed? Well, it turns out 182 of these chests were Bohea tea, the cheapest of the teas. And some of those chests weighed 400 to 450 pounds. The number 257 may not be impressive, but the total cargo amounted to 70,000 pounds of tea. This was humiliating for the city protesters, and even more so after receiving news of the outcomes in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. The activists would have to do better. On June 26th, the Magna Carta, captained by Richard Maitland, sailed into Charleston Harbor. Word quickly spread that the ship had 2.5 chests of tea on board. The Gazette speculated, it is expected that the captain will carry it back to England. It wasn't going to be anywhere near that easy. Charleston now had a permanent committee which included future President and Governor John Rutledge. Called before the committee at the exchange, the consignees declined the shipment. Captain Maitland swore he didn't know how the tea had gotten on board and further promised that he would prevent its offloading. Another standoff began. The customs officials did nothing. The committee did nothing as the 20-day deadline clock ticked away. The deadline passed on July 16th, but nobody budged. 2 days later, a rumor quickly spread that the customs officers were on the move. Word went out to the committee members to gather at the exchange. The members had just passed a resolution to hold Maitland to his word when somebody burst into the room declaring the shipment had been unloaded and was being stored where? Yep, exactly. The exchange cellars. The members hurriedly adjourned, hustled down the stairs, and burst outside, only to see the last chest being stored by the customs officers. This small shipment had literally been stored right under the committeemen's noses. Burkhardt claimed he knew nothing of the cargo. The consignees declined the shipment. The committee took no action. The deadline passed, and what became of the 5 chests? Stored in the exchange cellars again. Plenty of room. Plenty of room. Why had the Charlestonians been so timid in confronting the British customs officials on these 3 separate occasions? Perhaps the long-standing commercial ties with Great Britain were part of the reason. Being in the British Empire had been an invaluable asset. The colony's success began with marketing its 2 major plantation crops, rice and indigo. By 1730, rice did not have to be shipped to the British Isles, but could be sold in Southern Europe. And starting in 1749, the British government subsidized indigo production. Also, the Charleston elites were so enamored with the fashions, foodways, social amenities, and some claimed the immorality of the British aristocracy that Charleston became known as Little London. Little London. Nevertheless, opportunity had knocked, and the activists in Charleston had not answered. Okay, perhaps we should cut some slack for the London shipment, but after that, it was clear what the pattern was. At the expiration of the 20-day deadline, customs officers would seize the cargoes. The opportunity to destroy the 2nd and 3rd shipments was right there, looming in front of the protesters. Apparently, though the ties to the mother country were fraying, there was not yet the resolve to completely sever those connections. The expanded and anti-government sentiment needed some stiffening. Shortly after these 2 lost opportunities, Reverend William Tennant III, writing under the enigmatic pseudonym, the husband of the planter's wife, submitted a letter to the South Carolina Gazette. From a 21st century perspective, his plea was an ingenious way of gaining support. It was addressed to those who controlled the household purse strings. Women. On the surface, breaking the tea habit should have been as simple as tolerating the ill effects of caffeine withdrawal, but it was not. Tea drinking had insinuated its way into the American psyche, and women were largely responsible. Prevented by social convention from drinking tea in public houses, they instead brewed it and served it at home. They ritualized its preparation, presentation, and consumption, in both their families' daily routines and their own social lives. And to be sure, the loss of such a cherished amenity would be a sacrifice for most. The letter read, "Will not my fair readers be persuaded to lend their hand to save America from the dagger of tyranny? Will any female American indulge herself in so trifling an amusement at the danger of the lives and liberties of all she holds dear? Ladies, have you a spirit? Have you the soul of English women? I'm sure you have. If you thought you could do anything to save your country, I'm sure you would do it. I'm sure you can do it, if only you deprive yourselves of what? Your life? No. Your love? No. Your ease? Your daily bread? No. Only a mere ceremony. Worse, a time-consuming poison. A thing no one can pretend ever did any good. A thing which has, in the opinion of the best physicians, spread legions of disease all over Europe and America. A thing which has now become a political plague as well as a natural one." Once again, the misinformation concerning the harmful effects of the vile weed was used as a reason for its disuse. Unmentioned, however, was another tactic of the anti-tea propagandists, namely that the mischievous drug was a female aphrodisiac. Given the patriarchal attitudes of the day, this was most certainly another reason to forsake its use. Returning to the subject of soliciting the aid of women, this point cannot be overstressed. Preserve the peace and quiet of the community. So, what became of this tea? This is the tea that allowed Charleston to have a tea party. Okay, flash forward almost 2 years. On September 19th, 1776, the South Carolina legislature convened. President John Rutledge sent the members a long agenda, including a suggestion that the government sell the impounded seizures still held in the exchange cellars. The inventory from the London, Magna Carta, and Britain had grown to 264.5 chests. Apparently, this had been on Rutledge's mind for a while. Earlier, he had sent a letter to the South Carolina delegates at the Second Continental Congress, asking them to bring up the matter before the national legislature. In a subsequent letter to Rutledge, the delegates reported that when the motion was put up for discussion, the fellow delegates seemed intent on keeping the proceeds for the tea sales. The South Carolinians withdrew their motion and rebuked Rutledge for his short-sightedness. On September 20th, the General Assembly passed an act authorizing the tea liquidation. 4 commissioners, Roger Smith, Peter Legere, William Greenwood, and George Abbott, were appointed to handle the sales. Do any of those names sound familiar? Do you remember who these people were, or some of these people were, man? The first 3 I mentioned were the ones that had the original London consignment of tea. Obviously, they had rehabilitated their reputations in the intervening 3 years. They were about to be handsomely rewarded for their patience.